Welcome to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, and I'll be the host for today's program. I'm a professor of sociology at Western Michigan University. With me, as usual, is Don Cooney on my left here. And Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western and also is a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. Also with us, one of our regulars now, Felix Brooks. Felix is, an instructor in criminal justice at Western, but also his day job, I guess you could say now, is to be the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. And we have a very special guest back with us. She's been with us before, and hopefully she'll come a lot more.
Yes.
Denise Keele. Denise is a professor in political science and also in environmental and sustainability studies. I got it right?
Good job. You
All
got
right.
it. Perfect. Yes.
And Denise and I both work with the Western Michigan University Climate Change Working Group,
Yes.
and Denise pretty much chairs that that group anymore. It's been
They let me chair it. They let me tell them what to do. They're very nice about it.
Well, you've been doing a fantastic job,
Thank
and
you.
we do want to talk about an event that's coming up.
That's right.
So we'll get to that toward the end, and it has to do with our topic for today, which is to focus on an important new book. It's this book right here. I think we can get a good shot of it. It's Naomi Klein, the Canadian journalist, and this changes everything. Capitalism versus the climate. If you turn the book to the back side, you get the capitalism versus the climate part of the book. And this book came out last fall, and it's caused quite a stir. And Denise, let me start with you. Why should people read this book instead of some scientific tract on climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be on the show. This book, as Ron said, came out in 2014, so one of the really interesting things about it is it's so fresh.
Yeah.
Everything is super recent, super fresh, what's happening right now. So I think the book is really powerful in that. But more than that, as our climate change working group knows, we've given scientific presentations to scores of different audiences and publics. And I think that we're finally at a moment where we can start to move beyond the science and the debate over the science and say, yeah, that is settled. We're not even going to entertain maybe that scientific debate anymore. So the next question is, well, then what? If the science is settled, what do we do about it? And the reason I think people should read this book is this is a great start at the conversation about what social and economic things we ought to do to meet this challenge. We know it's happening. Now what? And that's why I think everyone should read this book. Yeah.
It's interesting. She starts off the book talking about a conference that she went to at I think sponsored by the Heartland Institute, one of those conservative think tanks that's been engaged in a lot of climate denialism. And part of the ideological denial and ideological opposition to doing anything about climate change is that somehow it's all this plot about big government, that this is a plot to allow big government to take over and run everything and to ram through their agenda. And climate change isn't really real. It's just this plot to expand the power of government and regulate corporations and do all these things. And Klein, to some extent, says, well, they're sort of right. You know, they're not right that this is not true. Climate change is happening. It is a real phenomena. But they are right in the sense that if we're going to respond, if we're going to really do something about climate change, it is going to demand a progressive agenda. I mean, only the state has the resources and the ability to appropriately respond, both to mitigate carbon emissions and to adapt to the climate change that's already built in. So I thought that was sort of an interesting take on that yes, they're right that it is going to require this progressive agenda. It's not a plot, it's not a conspiracy, but if we are going to respond, we have to do it in this way.
Yeah, and to stop, again, debating the science. You can't use science to debate a value base is her essential argument, which we know from the literature and from our working group. You can say to some a conservative ideologue all day long, the science says, but that's not what makes them change their opinion or mind about things. It's because that value base is so fundamentally threatened. So let's deal with that, right? And that's what this book is about. And I think you're exactly right. the folks who see the science and who care about this issue can't continue to argue the science. We need to just admit that, yes, this does mean a fundamental change in how we've been doing things. And the right is kind of right. We have to admit that, but that, as a politician knows, is also room to maybe build a coalition. So, yeah.
And that's not the first time in history when the only ones that could respond were the federal government, the Depression and in world wars.
Exactly.
Civil rights movement.
Civil rights movement.
Government responded when the private sector or the private public would not do that. So
That's right.
government had to step in.
Exactly.
I think the other thing she talks about with a lot of the deniers is that in order for them to get on board, it would mean that they have to change their narrative of the way they see the world.
That's right.
And they've seen the world with respect to climate this way.
Yeah.
And if you change that narrative, that means you have to see the whole picture. And the whole picture means that other folks are going to have to get involved and be real players here. And their whole position is based on this anti-big government sort of conspiracy that would take place if the government gets involved in anything that would be useful.
The very foundations of their whole ideology.
That's right. That's why it's about values and a threat to those values that some people have gotten really, really wealthy and really, really powerful on. So there's a larger sort of picture to this book, right? There's a larger social justice, a larger economic inequity argument that she's making. Who's profited and who's really in control. So
and it's not just about having the United States federal government get involved. This obviously has to be the international political community.
That's right.
We know that China and India, with their rapidly developing economies, are also throwing up huge amounts of carbon. And so if we're going to really limit global warming to the 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average, which is what all the political community at least has agreed upon that. I don't think there's a real important scientific basis for that. Any kind of global warming is bad, right? It's going to cause horrible things to happen.
Right.
But the consensus is we've got to hold it to 2 degrees.
And that means
the only way that's going to happen is if we get some kind of broad international agreement.
Absolutely.
But that raises all other kinds of issues of justice and equity with the global south and the countries that are just now rapidly developing compared to the European Union and the U.S. who have already developed and thrown up their more than their fair share of carbon into the atmosphere.
Absolutely.
Almost definitely so. You're talking that's what she's saying 8 to 10% cut emissions cuts over a 10-year period, which is actually what gets the ball rolling here. It can't be anything less than that if we're going to be realistic about this.
That's right.
But then it is also balancing who's going to do the lion's share of that work. The bigger, the more developed countries have to do more from the equity standpoint. We can't expect some of the smaller countries they don't have the resources to do that, but the big countries do. They have to take the lead here.
And they're responsible. They're responsible for what's happened before.
Right. Whereas right now we're asking the least responsible and the least able to bear the most burden. Right. And that's not what we think about when we think about equity. It's so interesting, at least Obama and China, we did sort of have sort of this agreement now, going into things, which is not very important scientifically. I don't think the emissions that China and the U.S. have agreed to limit is not important, I don't think, scientifically, but politically it's huge because it stops a little bit of this blame game that you're alluding to in that inequity. Well, whose fault is it, and therefore who should act? And the longer we stay in that kind of frame of mind rather than, no, let me do what I need to do, U.S., and no, now China is doing some things, that sets a whole new political stage to walk into negotiations in Paris next year and say, well, I can't no longer say because you're not doing it, I won't. That's fundamentally huge in this international arena.
And I think the Chinese have recognized, I think I said it on the last show, that I think it was the mayor of Beijing that said that right now, because of the pollution, our city is unlivable. I think they recognize that now.
Absolutely.
And the costs to healthcare system because of the pollution are becoming so overwhelming, they know they have to do something.
I mean, when you've got people walking around with these masks on their face as a daily habit, you've got a problem. You're putting far too much pollutants in the air, and it's having an impact on the population.
That's right.
Right, exactly.
While we're talking about the international dimensions of all this, Denise, maybe it would be helpful to our listeners to kind of go back and sort of sketch out briefly how this whole international negotiating thing works, because you mentioned Paris, and it's extremely important, because in Paris this coming December there's going to be a conference of parties.
That's right.
And everybody's pointing to this particular conference of parties as the time to finally get an agreement. But what's the sort of international
sort of larger,
political and legal basis for this? It goes back to the UN framework convention,
a little bit farther than that, and actually it's a point that Naomi Klein makes in her book, is to link, one of her chapters is about the bad timing of the news of climate change in the frame of the ideological and sort of things that are happening. It really goes back to kind of Star Wars, the space race program, actually, because we had to beat the Russians, right? And we had to know about atmospheric concentrations is where the science actually starts. It's always military. There are some good benefits that come out of that. But it's 1988 when James Hansen, scientist from NASA, that's why a scientist from NASA is involved in atmospheric concentrations, because we're worried about space race things. In 1988, he testifies to Congress to say this is happening, folks, and it happens to be the hottest year on record. The air conditioning is broke in Congress, so everybody is sweating as he's there that summer. What a great political timing, you would think, right? What else also happened in 1988, right? Ron, you were also in Germany. The next year, the Berlin Wall falls. We get the first free trade agreements internationally. So climate change sort of comes out at this time where we're moving towards all these other really neoliberal economic policies, and the community continues to try to deal with it. And so we set up the panel of scientists, the International Governmental Panel of Climate Scientists. That's 1988. 1992, the UN says, okay, we're going to be the spearhead for this, and that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. 144 countries say, oh yeah, absolutely, this is a problem. It's a policy tool that I like to call please. It's all voluntary. Wouldn't you please go home and do something about this? Okay, sure. Everybody goes home. Nobody does anything. And essentially, I think that's been the story. We're at the last conference of the parties was number 20. Right, so they meet about this every year, and Kyoto Protocol that you're probably familiar with is one of those conference of the parties. That was the big deal. That's 1997 to try to actually, well, how are we going to do this? It's essentially a cap and trade system. Of course, the U.S. famously refuses to ratify that treaty that Clinton does sign.
Clinton signed it, Bush unsigned it,
it's been back and forth. And there are Australia and our neighbors to the north, Canada, are also in that same, they've signed it and not signed it back and forth 2 or 3 times. So we've been in the cycle. One of the great quotes in the book on that bad timing chapter is a new UN delegate from one of the small island developing states. She says, she's very young, she says, you guys have been negotiating this since I was born. And so it can be a little daunting to think about the international arena. Now, what's supposed to happen this year, Paris 2015, is the deadline to re-sign the Kyoto Accords. That's essentially why everyone thinks this year is going to be a bit of a big deal. They've put a deadline on themselves. Now, politicians, I always like to say, what they giveth, they taketh away, right? So if I can say that we need to amend the deadline, but most people do not seem to want to change the deadline. So the idea is we're running into Paris next December. Are you ready to sign a new actual reductions agreement? So that's as brief as questions about, did I miss some big gaps that you think I should cover?
I would just add in that last fall, right as this book came out, there was a Ban Ki-moon brought people to New York, to the United Nations, and he was sort of trying to crack heads a little bit, I think, and say, look, and what I thought was interesting, because there was still a conference of parties to be held in Lima, Peru.
Lima, it is December, that's correct.
Last December, so this is even before that, but he's already pointing to Paris, right?
That's right.
And he said, because he knows there's no chance in Lima, right?
That's right.
In 2 months, there's no chance in Lima, but he's pointing ahead to Paris. So he brings everybody to New York, and he says, hey, you guys got to do this now.
That's right.
And so the timing was that while the world leaders were there gathering, in New York, there was this huge climate change march. So Bill McKibben and 350.org and a lot of the other social movement groups, environmental groups that are trying to work on this issue, held this massive rally and march through Midtown Manhattan. And there were 400,000 people that gathered in New York. And I was able to go
you were there.
to the march, and it was really fantastic to be there and to see the range of ages and races and class
Yes.
backgrounds and
Yes.
just all these people coming together for this one particular cause, which is we got to do something about climate change.
Right.
And it was meant to send a message to those world leaders gathered
Exactly.
that we're going to be meeting at the United Nations later that week. That hey,
That's
you
right.
got to take this issue seriously.
Right.
So I'll just add that point in that
Absolutely.
even before the Conference of Parties from 2014 was held, people were already pointing towards this one coming
Absolutely.
up.
Naomi
And-
Klein has a way of releasing books when whatever her issue is like, the Seattle protest for the World Trade Organization was going on when she released her last book. So I don't know how she does that. Her timing is
she's got really good timing.
it's great. But
yeah.
no, you're exactly right. And that did lead to, people say nothing came out of the last Lima, which was this December, Lima, Peru. You got to pick a good place to have your conference, right? You got to make sure you're going to the right place in December. That's always important. But they did get together draft language,
Okay.
right? So it's not like, we tend to say, well, nothing happened there. Well, that is this, it takes a while. This is the
Right,
lead up.
right, yeah.
So there's pressure, there's a draft, and now what's supposed to happen is all those countries are looking at that and what their election cycle is and thinking about Paris 2015.
Yeah. So I think there wasn't going to be any final agreement in Lima, but a lot of
We
important
knew that going
work,
in, as I guess.
a lot of the
yes.
important preparatory work had to go
That's
on
right,
there.
yeah.
So
And I think that's why Klein says about the march that sort of pressure needs to continue.
That's right.
Yeah.
At the
Yeah.
root, people need to still continue to get involved and be out on the
Right.
streets because this is what's going to get people's attention.
That's right.
That's how movements
And
happen.
you need to have that kind of pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you say there's a draft ready for Paris, or
There's a
and-
draft language about what those new agreements, so how much should each country be cutting their emissions by and how would that actually work, which
And
is
what does
based
that
on
look like?
Kyoto. So that's, 80% reductions by 2050 is what that looks like.
Wow.
So yeah, the time to act is getting shorter and shorter and the consequences of not acting are getting greater and
Yeah.
greater. So there's some real pressure, some real pinpoint. Yeah.
Wow.
So one of the things that Klein does very, very well in this book is to point out that this is not a scientific debate. The science is over, but it
That's
is a
right.
political debate, and it is an ideological debate. And that the part one of the book is titled Bad Timing.
Yes.
And we've made reference to that already, but part of the bad timing is the development of a neoliberal perspective,
Right.
which is an ideological movement which basically says government is bad.
Right.
Government can do no right. And therefore, we've got to roll back government
Right.
regulation of corporations. We've got to reduce the public sector in social investments. We've got to free up the market
Right.
to do its magic and to grow
Right.
the economy. And
Yeah.
the worst possible thing, if and of course people have massively bought into this
Oh,
free
yes.
market fundamentalism, into this neoliberal perspective.
Right.
Many nations around the world have bought into this particular set of economic doctrines. And of course it completely exacerbates the problem of climate change.
Right.
And so part of the bad timing is right at the moment
That's
we
right.
most needed to stop doing some of that stuff and respond to
Yeah.
carbon emissions and reduce carbon emissions, we're going in completely the opposite direction. And that train is going down the track at a pretty good speed.
Yes.
And now we got to try to stop it and,
Yes.
and bring it back. But that requires, again, this political and economic and ideological engagement.
Absolutely.
And that's part of what this book is trying to do then, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the one, maybe critique I would make is it's maybe not climate versus capitalism, it's climate versus neoliberal capitalism. I mean, we're talking about policies that have been around since the 1980s. Climate change started a long time before that with industrialization, but you're absolutely right. And again, it's that 1988, Reagan famously, right? The problem with government is government, right? Government is the problem. I'm here from the government. I'm here to help you, right? You guys know this, how this story goes.
In the English language.
That's right, and that's again our free trade agreements are starting at that time. Now Clinton is a part of that with NAFTA later on, so that just accelerates and exacerbates all privatization, deregulation, right? Lack of investment in the public sphere, all of those things, absolutely. Yeah.
But the paradigm is losing legitimacy. I mean, because of the
Thank you.
inequality, which people are becoming more and more aware of,
Right.
the unemployment, all the troubles in Europe.
That's right.
So, I mean, it's being challenged now.
It
so.
is. Well, and I think one of the points that Klein makes really well to that, Don, is we missed maybe a really golden opportunity. We had our own banks fail and our own auto industry fail, and wasn't that a referendum on free market, if there is such a thing, neoliberal
and lack of
capitalism?
regulation.
So that's what happens if you let it go completely, you know, and you even had, you know, economic scholars coming back and saying, well, you know, maybe this wasn't exactly what we meant by Keynesian economics, and that's the classic definition of when government steps in, right? Market failures. So if you don't believe that maybe it doesn't work, those two recent examples, and I know, you know, the students I teach point to that and say, well, obviously this doesn't work. Why? How could you be too big to fail? And what is the role of government in these types of situations, right? That's what Klein is talking about.
And it's interesting because you listen to folks talk about the free market and not wanting the government to intervene, which is precisely what we got in 2008.
Correct.
Government intervention.
Right.
That's a good.
The very thing that they fear the most now and they feared before.
That's exactly
was exactly what happened in 2008.
I think they call that irony.
And people tend to people have a short institutionalized memory, so they forget that.
Yeah.
We didn't get back to where we are today without the government getting involved.
Exactly.
It would be the same strategy you'd want to use with climate change.
That's right.
The government has to get involved.
Right.
I think that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if it wasn't for the stimulus, if it wasn't for the bailout, we would have lost. We would have been we wouldn't be back today to where we are.
That's right.
And I think one of the things that Klein tries to do is to say, look, there are many important issues, political and economic issues, that are involved in confronting free market fundamentalism and dealing with the problems that it presents.
Right.
And so if we're seriously addressing the climate issue, that means joining all these different issues together because they are all interrelated.
Right.
That's right.
We can't really just isolate climate change over here aside from some of the other economic issues.
That's right.
I know Klein has gone around and spoken to large labor organizations to say, look, you know, the struggle of organized labor is also the struggle for climate change, right, to deal with climate change. And so we have to see these alliances that have to be formed.
That's what
if
she
we're going
refers
to
to
make
as a social justice issue.
That's right.
Yes.
And in the interviews that I've seen with her lately, she talks about it. Social justice has been at the heart of why we need to do this.
Right.
Yeah.
And why and that means everybody has a vested interest. We're all stakeholders in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, inequity just isn't in environmental exposures, right? Inequity is in all sorts of policy areas. That absolutely.
And it's very clear that those on the right, those that are advocates for the neoliberal movement, recognize the threat. They recognize the powerful message of dealing with climate change and what a threat that is to their vested economic and political interests, which is why we get the counter movement, right?
That's
which
exactly
is why we get the denialism. What the denialism really involves is the fossil fuel industry itself massively funding conservative think tanks like the Heartland Institute and the people like the Koch brothers who also are part of the fossil fuel industry, funding right-wing groups, and Americans for Prosperity is their group. And then these groups then bring in people who have some scientific credentials. They're not climate scientists, but they bring in people who have some scientific background, and now they can say, well, these scientists say, you know, this, that, and the other thing. Well, they're not climate scientists. They don't publish in that area. They don't do research in that area. Just because they are a scientist in some other realm doesn't mean they know anything about climate change. But of course, it's the purpose is just to create doubt.
To create a counter narrative.
That's
Create a counter narrative, sowing doubt, right? That's their mission.
Playing to people's fears and insecurities.
That's right.
And if you can create enough doubt and rouse those insecurities, then you can block the political action from happening.
Because then they throw in the whole argument about this is going to be catastrophic for our economy. It's going to kill jobs. I mean, that's the mantra that you hear.
Exactly.
You know, and it's not an either or sort of thing.
That's right.
You know, what we know in Europe is that clean energy has created jobs and a lot of jobs. You know, and in the United States, we've gotten on board that train way late. And they've been doing it in Germany and other places in Europe for a long time. They've actually created jobs by becoming the cleaner, you know, the way they do their business there.
That's true.
But I think you're exactly right. The right absolutely sees a threat, and they are putting up a fight, and they are putting up a good fight so far. A fight that is beating the rest of this argument down. And Merchants of Doubt was another book that was out a year or two ago that sort of talked about
Naomi Aruske.
Yes, thank you. I couldn't remember the author. The same, a lot of the same people who are working against the climate movement or climate moment, if you will, are the same people who started the anti-science against tobacco.
Yes,
And,
right.
you can't prove It's
Yeah.
actually been the same argument. It was so successful then that
Yeah.
well, why not just carry this forward, right?
But Klein says there's a huge procrastination
Yes.
penalty we will pay.
That's right.
If we don't do this now, if we wait,
That's
it's
right.
going it's certainly going to cost more money. But there's going to be a penalty involved in this.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right. Right, and that's why you say that in Paris, now it's up.
That's
We got
right.
the cuts have to be so much more.
That's
So
right.
one strategy
Yeah.
is to sow doubt. The other strategy
Yes.
is to get their people in positions of power
That's
in the government
exactly right.
who keep it off the agenda
That's exactly
and who confuse the whole issue, but they're their people, and they
That's right.
keep us from
This
doing it.
last election cycle, I read a study that said the Koch brothers, who are anti-climate policy, as most as you can probably get, contributed $400,000 a day to some sort of campaign that was going on across
Wow.
the country. So that money in politics is certainly part of this.
Yeah.
It's not the whole story, and
Right.
I don't think you're going to get rid of money in politics. Sorry, as a political science professor, that's probably not going to happen. But definitely there's this, then the influence of that money is seen. And we just elected a very conservative Congress.
Yeah.
Both the House and Senate are now Republican, and most of the leaders of those committees have been climate science deniers. If you're not, the Senate just voted a couple weeks ago that climate change is actually not a hoax. So that climate change was not a hoax
They put
was
that
the
as
bill.
a rider to the
That's-
Homeland Security bill.
that's correct.
Bernie Sanders tossed that in there. You
That's
know.
correct. So it did pass, but it doesn't yet say human-induced climate
Yeah.
change is not a hoax. So there's some very interesting folks in positions of power right now that, Klein calls it blockadio what the citizens movement is. In political science, it's always the power of the status quo, though. I mean, really what the climate deniers and the Koch brothers have on their side is that we don't yet have climate policy. It's
Yeah.
much easier to block policy change and to sit back and defend against something than it is to create something new. And so they also have that inertia on their side, which is hard to break. It takes a lot more energy from the other folks arguing to overcome that. Yeah.
And these folks are well funded. I mean, let's
They are.
make no bones
Ooh,
about that. They're
boy.
extremely well funded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they have a really strong ground game, and we saw that in the
That's right.
midterm elections.
That's right.
And the Citizens United Supreme Court
Correct.
decision allows for an unlimited use of corporate money.
That's right.
So the fossil fuel industry and the Koch brothers can throw whatever. And the
Yes.
Koch brothers have said what they're going to put,
Billion.
almost $1 billion
Almost $1
into
billion.
the 2016 election cycle.
And they're
Yes.
they're one group, one
Two brothers, and
Yeah,
one
yeah.
group is
Exactly.
going to throw,
Exactly.
that's just an incredible
Yeah.
amount of money. So
There are some billionaires on the climate change side, and Klein makes that point that that's not even going to be what maybe saves us either. There's
Right.
no climate change billionaire messiah coming.
yeah,
for
the title of that chapter is No Messiahs.
That's what it is, thank you.
The green billionaires won't save us, she
No.
said. So,
No.
So the hope is with
Yes.
social movements.
That's
Yeah.
exactly
And
right.
the issue is, what can we learn from past social movements that will help us in the struggle today?
Exactly. What kinds of communities did we build? Like
Right.
the examples that you were already giving, World War II, and how did we do these things
Civil rights
before?
movement.
The Depression.
Labor.
Right. What kind of values and civic institutions did we build during those times that made us succeed, right?
Yes.
That's what we
Yes.
ought to be looking at.
Yep.
Yes.
and building those coalitions is
I
going to
agree.
be
Mhm.
critical.
That's it.
I think one of the important points that I really picked up from the book that I hadn't really sort of zeroed in on is the real importance of indigenous rights and
Yes.
indigenous peoples movements,
Ah.
because they're the ones right now that are on the front line.
That's right.
Maybe I should backtrack just a little bit and say the problem is for the fossil fuel industry that the easy to access oil is drying up,
Yeah.
right? Or they're being pumped
That's
out,
right.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if they're going to continue to operate and profit, they've got to find other sources of fossil fuels. But the easy access oil and gas is gone for the most part. So now what they're doing is they have to move off and engage in more extreme tactics of tapping into even dirtier energy sources. So just to give you 3 examples. We have to move offshore and drill in deep water. And so what happens, we get the British BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, right, that took place back in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. Or there's all this, the tar sands up in Alberta, Canada. And they're up there trying to extract this extremely dirty oil out of that, but that has to be piped then down, and so this is the whole Keystone XL pipeline deal, and we in Michigan know all about pipelines, and in fact it was that extremely dirty bitumen, is that the name of the oil, that leaked into the Kalamazoo River.
That's exactly right.
A couple of years ago. So you've got that problem, and then the other example is the shale oil and trying to this hydraulic fracturing, we call fracking. Again, another extreme method to extract some type of in this case, natural gas. And of course, there are all kinds of issues and problems, despite those commercials that you see on television that say, oh, there's no problem with fracking. There are huge problems with fracking. Groundwater contamination is one of them. And another is the release of huge quantities of methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas.
Correct.
And in fact, what's really scary about all of these methods of extreme extraction, whether it's the deep water drilling or getting the tar sands, oil out of the tar sands, or fracking, is that you have to invest huge amounts of energy to do these things, releasing huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. You have to use tons of water in most of these methods, or you're polluting water, as in the Gulf of Mexico. And fracking, of course, that's one of the concerns there. If those things aren't done exactly right, there can be huge groundwater contamination. And so it just seems strange that we're investing all this amount of energy and throwing up more carbon into the atmosphere to get at more fossil fuels, which then, once we get those and burn them, it's game over, right? I mean, that's what James Hansen said.
That's
if
exactly
we actually get the tar sands thing going, then the game's over for trying to do something about climate change.
That's right. The bad news is there is a carbon budget. there is so much under the earth, and there's only so much that we can have in the atmosphere, folks. And releasing more and more of that is the tipping point. And frankly, that is, to me, the most powerful point that Klein makes as well, that those 3 things that you bring up, Ron, are what she would call these new carbon frontiers, right? And that seems to have finally elicited some of the social mass movement against. It's like, because the logic of that doesn't make sense to most people. Why, given this problem, would I expand into a new carbon technology frontier field when I know that I'm supposed to be moving in the other direction? Why would we continue to do that? And that's usually the political reason given for why you see so much activity against the Keystone pipeline, right? There are tons of pipelines. We've been doing this for a long time. That's not the only one that's being built, but it's about this new source. And I think that has really finally triggered people to say, no, this is where it does stop. We're not going to go after new sources of carbon. That's where it stops. And that's the whole blockadian, where that movement, the populist side of that movement, seems to be coming from. And I think why we're focused so much on things like Keystone, because it's a new source. Why go after that? It's just illogical at this point, when we know the wrong direction.
And if anything, when the price of oil bottomed out this last fall, we learned that we don't have to go there now.
That's right.
There's an abundance and oversupply of oil on the market already, which is why the Saudis said, you know what? Usually the Saudis would come in and intervene and they stabilize prices. This time they said, you know what? We're not doing anything. We're going to let it, whatever happens, happens. Which to me was a signal that, there's enough oil on the market already. We've way more than what we need right now. We don't have to continue to do this.
Especially taking into account the need to begin to limit that consumption of oil. And I always go back to Bill McKibben, who was here on our campus a year or so ago, but McKibben's terrifying math, right?
Yes.
So again, the three numbers he said that are important. Yeah. So 2 degrees Celsius,
That's
which
right.
we already mentioned earlier, which
That's
the
right.
political community has said is the limit. We can't have global warming above 2 degrees Celsius, above the pre-industrial average. 565 gigatons was the second number. That's the amount of fossil fuels that can be extracted and burned and stay under the 2 degrees Celsius limit. But the third number, and the scary number, the terrifying number, is 2,795, which is the amount of fossil fuels that are on the books that the fossil fuel industry plans to extract and to sell and to burn. And again, that's way beyond what we can allow, 5 times what we can allow if we're going to stay under the 2 degrees Celsius. So if the fossil fuel industry continues with its normal business plan, what it's already planning to do, which means also going out to continuing these extreme extraction strategies, then we're going to run way past the 2 degrees Celsius, and we're going to fry the planet. I mean, to put it as simply as possible, we'll burn the planet if we do what they're planning to do. Their normal business plan will cause the destruction of the earth. I mean, that's not too apocalyptic to put it, I don't think.
I don't think so.
So that's why, again, McKibben and others are saying, look, the fossil fuel industry is a rogue industry. It's an outlaw industry, and we've got to do something about this industry, which means, again, the government has to step in, start to regulate this industry, put investments into clean technologies to gain energy. And yet all that is being blocked by the denialism and the political obstruction that takes place in Congress.
That's right.
Hence Klein's argument in her book, I think, to try to mobilize the counter movement against this.
Well, what's the other thing that a politician responds to? If it's not money, I do respond to the mass electorate. And if you can get public opinion and that swayed, then you will get a response, because my #1 job is to get reelected. And money will only go so far in that. And if you do have a real populist movement, we've seen it over and over again. That's how we got the environmental movement to begin with, how we got all the laws that we do have on the books. So I think that, Donna, thank you for saying the word hope, because I think there are some things that are happening here. And there is what we call the blue-green alliance. The labor and the green movements are starting to realize they're actually arguing the same point. Their interests are aligned. There is an uprising at the social mass movement level against things like Keystone Pipeline. You know, there is still an environmental movement that's doing a lot. You know, one point of contention, Klein would argue they've sold out a little bit, but you know, I don't need to blame anyone who's been fighting the right fight. I think you want everybody on your side that you can get, for sure. But there are some things that we can do, right? The carbon tax is supported by almost all of those groups, and that's what the economists say we ought to do. We know how to do this renewable energy technology. We could be putting that in. It requires decentralization rather than centralized control, right? That's part of her argument about equity, I think, is really important. Where are fossil fuels found, and how hard is it to get them, and how expensive? Very concentrated, very expensive to go get, so then that wealth ends up being concentrated as well. Where is the sun? Well, not today in Kalamazoo, but where is the wind? Where is the water? That's much more accessible to all of us. So this is a real challenge to power.
It is.
But it's hopeful, because it's all right there for us.
Yeah, because there is a clash of values here, a tremendous clash of values. It's about individualism versus community.
That's right.
It's about personal wealth versus equity. And it's about freedom versus responsibility. And I think we sometimes make the mistake to think that the people that got power have the same values as us. They don't have those values.
Right.
But the vast majority of the people do.
That's right.
And that's where our strength is. And that's what King did in the civil rights movement. He appealed to the... He knew that people believed in those basic values, even though the people that had power didn't. So he mobilized them, and I think that's what we have to do.
So then the scales of justice bend towards
Yes.
what's right.
Yes.
Always been that way. So
There are another issue that I think has to be addressed is that to deal with climate change we're going to have some long-term planning.
Yes.
And of course, free market fundamentalism is let the market decide.
Right.
That's right, yeah.
And,
Socialist.
Anything goes.
I mean, that's a dirty word for whatever reason in
Exactly. It
American
is.
politics. It's in,
It is, but
Yeah.
but certainly, if we're going to have any hope to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius,
yeah.
We have to have some long-term planning. And following that planning, then you've got to have significant strategic investments
That's right.
in
Right.
creating the clean,
Right.
the
That's
clean
right.
energy that we need. There has to be some effort to regulate the corporate entities
exactly
that
right.
continue to extract and burn carbon. And so this is part of Klein's argument that,
Yes.
hey, you know, the public sector has been continually weakened
Yes.
by neoliberal capitalism, but just the opposite has to happen if we're going to have any chance to save the planet.
Right, or respond,
Yeah.
or our own adaptation in any way. But again, we've done this before. The Great
Yes.
Depression is a perfect example of that, right? The 1960s, again, a perfect example. World War II, we've done those. I mean, why do we have an interstate system? Because
Yeah.
of public investments.
Exactly.
Why do we have railroads? Because of public investments. And let's not forget, why do we have fossil fuel technology? Because of public investments. There's also a lot of subsidies that went into those technologies. So it's about moving that direction and that what is the goal, right? It's about moving that target, not about whether government is the problem. Obviously, government has done all of these things before. It's about who wins and loses
Right.
from those different scenarios. So absolutely, long-term planning is going to be a huge one of those to recreate that public infrastructure that, again, I think people are starting to challenge as you see
too.
bridges crumbling and,
right.
and folks kind of saying, well, where is my public sphere? Who is taking care of this? And people willing to pay a little bit in a tax, I think, in order to get those services. If that message can be communicated about what you get, you're not just getting taxed and that goes to some inefficient behemoth thing that isn't answerable to you, right? That's part of the rhetoric. It can go to something that you could actually benefit from. You drive on these roads every day. That was a public investment, and that story hasn't been told.
Yeah.
I don't think.
We haven't done near a good enough job of
No.
putting that
Right,
narrative
right.
out there.
And the other area is public health. With
Yes.
Ebola
Great
and the
point.
communicable diseases, they're saying, well, what are you guys going to do? Oh, that's federal government.
That's
It's
right.
got to
Yeah.
step in and do that.
That's right.
But we know that we can't deal with that
Yeah.
without the federal
Yeah.
government.
That's right.
Yeah, to be involved.
I mean, one thing that ecology teaches us that politics has yet to learn is that we actually are interconnected. We actually are interrelated. An ecological view of the world starts with that premise. And the political, all politics is local is still true, but we are connected here, folks, and all of these issues are connected. And our politics has yet to catch up with that in many ways.
And we saw that with Ebola.
Yeah.
The gut reaction from a lot of people on the right was to close our borders.
Yeah.
But
Right.
the problem, if you're going to deal with Ebola, you have to deal with it there
That's
and
right.
here.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Because we're one world. You can't do it. The fact that we waited so long to even do anything with respect to the development of vaccine
Right.
is what ended up costing us in the first place, and in Africa.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
the private corporations, private drug companies who do this stuff to develop these vaccines wouldn't get involved.
They wouldn't get the money. They wouldn't make that money because that's a one-shot thing. You vaccinate somebody, that's a one-shot thing. They'd rather take somebody that every day has to get something, and they can make money
Because
on
they
that.
didn't see any profit in it. And that's
Right.
where the government needs to be able to step in and say, no, we can do this. We can make this happen, and we have to do this. Because the private sector is not going to do it.
Right.
They're interested in profits.
And what that does also, it brings it out that it has to be done internationally because it's not enough just to do it here, just like you say.
That's right.
Have to deal with that
That's right.
internationally.
And this is where I wouldn't go so far as to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater of capitalism. I think,
No.
what we're also talking about is that people do respond to incentives. And if profit is an incentive, right, but what is the role of government?
Right.
To harness and regulate that incentive towards public goals, towards the public interest. So I think that I don't go so far as to say that we would have to get rid of all profit motive, but I do think there's a larger role for government and the public sector here in harnessing that profit motive to get the behaviors that we see that are beneficial to everyone.
Especially when it comes to these types of issues.
Absolutely, because otherwise, it is a much harder sell and the coalitions that you do need to build. Of course, there's going to be a large free market ideological still in this country, and that's part of our culture. So I think still working with that rather than saying, no profit for anyone, it's probably where I fall just to.
And you tweak the system, because a lot of people get confused that if they think anybody critiques capitalism, they're critiquing democracy.
Good point.
And the two couldn't be further from the truth.
Just the opposite.
Good point.
We still want a democratic system, but we want a democratic system that is willing to step in and curtail some of our, how should we say, when we go away, our excesses. Exactly.
That's right.
Externalities is
That's
the term.
is the economics word. Well, because it's also about because democracy, you bring up a really excellent point, because one of the things that when I read the book, I think, well, but communism they still emitted carbon. Communism didn't stop emissions of carbon. But so democracy, right, is a different accountable system about what the public goals actually are. And so when you combine that with the investments that we're talking about, then I think you can get the solutions that you guys have alluded to so nicely that we've been able to do before.
Democracy gives us a better mechanism to get those needs met.
Absolutely.
Because people can get involved. They don't have to be fearful.
Unfortunately, the midterms was the lowest amount of voting in history. That has to change. This is about building a larger civic culture in order for the voices that need to be heard to get heard in that system.
And I think that comes back to what Don said earlier. We have to do a better job of creating a narrative that's going to resonate with the public. And that's starting to happen.
Yeah, I think it is.
That's why I think we should read this book. This is great to talk about.
One of the things that Klein talks about in the books is extractivism as a kind of broad perspective on the relationship of the economy to the environment.
Right.
And it's clear that it goes beyond capitalism.
Absolutely.
You could have other forms of economic systems that are also dependent upon extracting fossil fuels or extracting other critical minerals or products from the earth that are necessary for economic production. So, and if that's carried out in a way that's destructive to the environment, to ecosystems, then there's the larger problem. So extractivism, I like that chapter on extractivism, because obviously the Soviet Union and China have been enormously polluting societies as well. And so it's just this broader issue of extractivism. The issue, though, with capitalism that I think also needs to be addressed is the focus on growth.
Yes.
The focus on economic growth.
Absolutely.
Because you cannot, capitalism is based on a notion of almost endless economic growth.
Yeah.
You cannot have endless economic growth on a planet with finite resources. It just can't happen. I mean, there is a bottom line at which we're talking about the destruction of the ecosystem and the destruction of the planet. So I think the heart of the critique of capitalism is that the focus on economic growth, or
unlimited
growth,
unfettered growth,
putting growth as a political goal above anything else is the heart of the problem here.
Yes, well said.
And has to be addressed, I think, within our political and economic
system. We need to better talk about rhetoric or narrative. We usually call that some sort of planned or regulated growth. Those are terrible terms. We need something better to describe this idea of how you move forward with a planned economy. There needs to be some work on the narrative.
Well, sometimes the term social democracy is used to talk about a kind of a third way, where there is a very strong public sector within a capitalist economy.
That's right.
That and so that I think that term, I like that term, and again, because it goes back to something that you were talking about. It does talk about the democratic values and the democratic processes that are absolutely essential here, but it also means a strong role for the public sector to play to advance certain important goals, or to make sure that certain kinds of efforts are made, certain kinds of plans are formulated that are going to address these critical environmental concerns in particular.
Especially, the whole ability to do long-term planning is going to be critical for something like this. This is not something that's going to show up on a quarterly balance sheet, nor should it.
That's right, exactly.
And we have to create that narrative where people understand this is a long-running issue, and we need to have long-term plans in order to make it happen. So.
And I think that's one of the problems, because people want to see immediate stuff, immediate results. In the civil rights movement, we could see some immediate results from that. In the labor movement, we could see some immediate results. The gay and lesbian movement, we see some. But in this, it's longer term. And that's harder to sell people.
That's right. So you're asking costs now, benefits later,
Yeah,
which is
right.
the opposite of how we are
Yeah.
supposedly wired. I want it now and I want to pay later is usually how that works. But I think, thank you for bringing up the chapter on extractivism, because I even think it's broader than that. Like you said, there are all sorts of social and economic systems that lead to environmental destruction. That's been sort of our failure as a human species over this time. And so it actually relates back to our fundamental understanding of what is our relationship with the environment, with the natural world. And Klein does a nice job of sort of saying where that sort of takes off with scholars like Francis Bacon, or the creation of the steam engine, and sort of that dominion or that master over the environment rather than part of. And you know, that's what the environmental movement has done so well, is to start that narrative and to start to change that consciousness and that part of the culture that I think is going to be fundamental side by side with whatever institutional changes we make. There's like a philosophical understanding here, and everything that's built on just pure Marx, capitalist extraction, get the added value out of there, is not quite the system we actually live in when we think about the finite resources of the earth, and that we are maybe one species among many. So that is, I think, something that we've been starting to change in the environmental movement.
I just finished reading The Sixth Extinction.
Oh, thank
by
you.
We were talking
Elizabeth
about that
Cole.
when we came in here.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, when you realize the Anthropocene is what she talks
That's
about,
exactly
that this
right.
is the way we live,
That's
the
right.
way we act, the consequences of that for the rest of the elements on the earth, the other species, is just devastating.
That's right. Yeah. You know, George Carlin always says the earth needs the comedian. The earth needs us, but we need the earth, but I'm not sure the earth needs us. Like, what, you know, it might reject us at some point here.
I think so.
Which is coming shortly, it looks like.
Yeah.
And again, Klein talks a lot about indigenous cultures and indigenous
Yeah.
rights, because that narrative
Yeah.
that you were talking about of that you know,
Yes.
the reciprocity
That's
that
right.
has to occur between
harmony.
humans and their relationship to their ecosystems
Exactly.
is really at the heart of a lot of indigenous cultures.
That's
And of course, it's also indigenous rights that are most likely to be violated by some of
That's
the more
right.
extreme forms of extractivism, as
right.
we're seeing up in Alberta.
That's right.
With the tar sands battles that are going on up there.
Yeah.
So we're running a little bit short of time. I wanted to have you talk just a little bit about Blockadia, the chapter where Klein is saying, you know, well, the final part is starting anyway, right? Even though this is a massive problem, we got to start anyway, and part of that is what she sees as these various social movements that are going on. Can you just sort of briefly
Sure, they're
talk
popping
about
up.
that?
The good news is that they're popping up all over the country against all sorts of small and local types of issues. I mean, the Keystone Pipeline is the most visible and the most national, but these kinds of blockadia, the sort of stopping the new carbon frontier in my backyard, is happening all over. Michigan is a great example of that, with the fracking campaigns that have gone on at the local level here to stop that leasing on private land. So I think that just knowing that that's happening all over, and that the local coalitions that are being formed is really important. And Kalamazoo is actually a good example of that. 2 years ago, we started a Kalamazoo Climate Change Coalition. There are like 7 different working groups trying to stop or promote the right. I mean, and that's where it has to start. So one argument that can be made is if it's not going to happen at the international level, and we've got at least 2 years where it's probably not going to happen at our own federal level in the United States, given the election that we just survived, then what can local communities do? Let's start from the grassroots. Let's start from the bottom up again. And that's how the environmental movement, how the civil rights movement, how most of the things we've been talking about were actually successful, was to make sure they built that bottom up base instead of a top-down approach. And I think now folks are actually doing that. And she's got a whole chapter, just example after example. So when you need hope, that's a chapter to go to, in my humble opinion. So.
And let's talk about what's going to happen locally.
Yes.
Because the Climate Change Working Group on campus is organizing an important event coming up, and I'll hold up the flyer, and maybe we can get a.
Don't know if you can read that.
I don't know if you can read that flyer
so
or not.
We have, I'll just have to say it. So we have a great working group on campus. It's about 30 different faculty who are interested in climate change, and one of the things that we do is try to promote some sort of education and outreach. And again, we thought, well, we've been given lots of great scientific talks, but what's the next step? What do we actually do? And so we're sponsoring a common read of This Changes Everything, and we got some funding together, and we just put almost 50 free copies of this book out in the community. And the Kalamazoo Public Library has been a great partner and gotten a lot of extra copies, which are all checked out, I'm sorry to say. But so read your book and bring it back, people. So we're hoping that everyone will read this book. As you can see, there are a lot of engaging issues that we talked about today, and then come together to discuss some themes in the book. And that will be Thursday, April 9th, 6 to 8:30 at the Kalamazoo Public Library. There will be some food there. We realize that's the dinner hour. If that's what you need to come in and discuss, that'd be great. And the main point is to end that night on Thursday, April 9th, with local climate leaders coming in and talking about the things that they are actually doing, so that we leave with action. So my motto is read together, discuss together, act together is what I think that event will hopefully culminate in.
So again, Thursday, April 9th, 6 o'clock to 8:30. It'll be at the Kalamazoo Public Library, the Van Dusen Room up on the 3rd floor.
Yes.
Light fare will be provided,
Yes.
as we say. So that means food.
You know, that
so we
does
will
mean
have some
food. Yes.
And we are hoping to have a couple of people sort of outline the broad themes of the book, right?
That's right.
And then we're going to break down into smaller groups.
Right.
And each small group is going to have somebody from the climate change working
I
group
think that's
there.
the plan, yes.
Is that still the plan?
Yes.
I've been going for a while, so
No, that's okay. This was a great, I had to get my notes and my act together to figure out what my themes were, so thank you.
So, and if anybody wants more information, you can check out on the screen right now, Denise's email at Western Michigan University is up there. And so again, she would be happy to provide you with some information.
Absolutely.
As she said, we do have free copies of the book
That's right.
out in the community, and we're trying to get those circulated as widely as
That's
possible.
Right.
We want people to read the book and then come together. So even if you don't have a chance to read the book, you're still invited to come that night. We'll be talking about some of the broad themes in the book.
Good point.
And we're going to try to get some students involved.
Yeah.
And again, often when we have these kind of events, we get everybody really concerned about this issue, and then we sort of leave them high and dry because we don't really provide them with something that they can do.
Some action steps.
We're going to really try hard to make sure that if you come and talk about this book and you're concerned about this issue and you want to take some action, we're going to be able to link you up with some local group or individual who's working on this and provide a way for you to deal with it. So, well, Denise, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Great fun as always.
And we'll definitely have you back because there are a lot of other issues that we can continue to talk about here. Felix, thanks again for all your insights. Don,
thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Critical Issues. And we invite you back next time for more discussion of critical issues, alternative views. Good night.